and I'll be your referential contact point for this activity, along with all the great colleagues from NEPS, Pietro, Rafaela, and Petra. Yeah, all right. So just a couple of information before we apologize for this 10-minute delay. Unfortunately, you are a lot of people to deal with, which makes us very happy because this will be a very relevant event for us, a great opportunity to bring experts from both the EU and outside of the EU to share knowledge, to share experience in the area of migrant education. Just a couple of information before getting started. I know that not all of you managed to sign up the list, so I invite those who did not do so yet to kindly sign before moving to the other venue, which is the Untitled Palace. If you think you might get lost and your Google Map doesn't work properly, we also provide you with some maps on the table there, so feel free to take them. There are also extra programs if you didn't manage to get one, and I would like also to apologize because there is a little mistake on the program. Ms. Sarah Breslin from the European Center for Modern Languages of the Council of Europe, unfortunately, is not mentioned, but she will be present in the workshop on multilingualism. I think we can get started. I would like to leave the floor and then invite Mr. Stasha Stančić, representative of the Ministry of Science and Education of Croatia, to join us from the podium. So, Mr. Stančić, the floor is yours.
It is really my great honor and pleasure to greet you today on behalf of the Ministry of Science and Education of the Republic of Croatia at the opening of the conference Inclusive Education for All, from Ideas to Action. One of the main positions of the Ministry of Science and Education is that all children are entitled to an equal access to quality education. Quality education for every student is a precondition to equal inclusion in the society and active participation in the European surroundings that we live in. Considering that education is one of the key factors of social integration and success of an individual, and that school is a public institution with an influence on the broader social community, inclusive education policy measures are the answer to the challenge of creating a better future for the community as a whole. There are examples of good cooperation in the community teaching us that without the engagement of all community members, there is no progress. Therefore, I invite everyone gathered here to jointly remember that along with human rights, there is also comes responsibility, and that it is our duty as carriers of rights to respect the human rights of other human beings. Finally, a democratic society and equal citizens cannot exist if there are groups which are excluded or on the margin of society. Therefore, there cannot be a successful educational system that does not recognize the solution of the issue of inclusive education for all. Understanding, accepting, and acknowledging the richness of differences, as well as focusing on diminishing discrimination of the members of other culture, is the foundation of successful social development. The ability to understand each other, to cherish an active attitude encouraged by the recognition of universal human rights and fundamental freedoms of others is a precondition to creating a diverse democratic society. Developing those skills is the foundation of the immediate understanding of the causes of social, ethnic, and cultural misunderstandings that are manifested through violence, discrimination, racism, hate speech, etc. The Ministry aims to make the school an integrative social factor that enable the children to recognize the school reflects and supports the reality of the community. It is therefore important to take special care of learning about each other and to establish the norm of cooperation, mutual recognition, the cherishing of differences and tolerance. The Ministry will on the path additionally empower its strategic commitments by new activities and promote it in the existing circumstances in cooperation with other institutions, institutions and organizations of the civil society. All this will create sustainable conditions for upgrading education in the Republic of Croatia in order to enable all children and young people to successfully overcome hurdles in education and join actively in the life of the community. I would like to point out that in the recent period, big and important changes have been made in the field of the implementation of in the inclusion in the educational system, and Croatia, as many other states, when it comes to inclusion in education. But this does not mean that we can be satisfied with all achievements in practice and that there is no room for further improvement. Finally, it's necessary to invest further efforts to actually implement the law in real life. Therefore, we welcome all early initiatives in the Republic of Croatia and all countries that contribute to this, especially the efforts of educational institutions and their staff, the engagement of the organization of the civil society sector, as well as all other promoters of inclusion. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful conference.
One of the participants who unfortunately could not make it because of a flight, being very delayed yesterday, so unfortunately Ms. Aroni from the Greek Minister will not be with us. I'll leave the floor to you, Lara and Thomas.
Good morning, everybody. Before we move to multi-panel, a little introduction and welcome from our sides of the two networks that have joined efforts for this inclusive education. In the name of NEPC, I welcome you all to Zagreb. I welcome you all to Croatia. We're very excited to have this joint event, as this is something that overlaps the two networks. So, Network of Education Policy Centers and SIRIUS Policy Network for Migrant Education have some long tradition of cooperation, almost 8 years or so. But this is our first big joint event, and we're very excited that we could do it remotely. We have 33 countries represented at this conference, over 130 people. Thank you very much for coming. And we hope that it will be a productive day. So, inclusive education. The promise of inclusive education has been with us for some time. Unfortunately, we don't seem to be there yet. In many of our countries, we have a long, long way to go. There are a few things that we need to do if we are going to achieve this dream or this promise, and many things that we could do ourselves. One of the things that we must continue to do is keep the dialogue open. And of course, it's very easy to be on the same page with people that we agree with. And I guess even in this room, although we come from 33 countries and from many different areas of work, we will still have this inclusive education as something that we're hoping for, a common thing. It's good to have a common thing, but we also must talk to the others who might not understand and might not believe what we believe. So keeping the dialogue open with the others is a crucial thing if we're going to go somewhere. We do a lot of bonding in our networks. The networks are part of this idea that we bond with those who want the same things, who are doing the same things as us, or at least have the same objective. What we seem to be missing is the bridging part. So we are not building a lot of bridges to those who are not on the same page with us. This conference kind of is trying to bridge a little bit. And with bridging between the two conferences, we hope that we're bridging in other ways. I hope you won't mind if I do a little exercise with you. It will be a very simple one. It won't require a lot of moving, but some moving. So I want to see who we have in this conference. So what are we bridging? Number one, we're bridging geographies. So can I have all of those who are not from Europe stand up? Not from Europe. Not from Europe? Okay. Big minority, but some. Do we have anybody who's not from EU? Okay. Slightly growing number. Of course, the rest, I guess, are then from the EU, so I won't ask you to stand up. So except for bridging geographies, we are also trying to bridge stakeholders. Okay. So I think the smallest group we have, but I might be wrong, we'll try, policymakers. I think not bad. Okay, then I guess we also have those from academia and research part of the sector. Researchers, university people. Okay, so it's an interesting topic to research, I see. Okay. How about people from schools, teachers, directors? Okay, schools. Okay, we have to work on that, obviously, because we are all talking about schools and what happens in schools. What about the civil society in NGOs? Okay, good. And out of you, how many would you call yourselves grassroots organizations? Okay, another. Okay, thank you very much. So, what I want to point out is, I'm sure that in this room you have people who you haven't talked to in the stakeholder world for the last, let's say, 1 week. So your task is, by the end of the day, I want you to find one stakeholder group that you haven't talked to and try to make a bridge. Hopefully that will make us a step further into this multi-stakeholder action towards inclusive education. Before I end, I want to also go a little bit to the topics of our conference. And as you know, we are focusing on inclusive education with 3 tracks. And let's see how we do with that. So, how many of you, English language is your mother tongue? Stand up, minority. Okay. 6. Okay. But you're all speaking English here. That tells us something. Okay. So, how many of you have been schooled in a language which was not your mother tongue? Okay. So it seems to be a good topic. We need to talk about those who are schooled in a language which is not their mother tongue. And this is our multilingual panel that will be moderated by Tom, who's somewhere in the room. There he is, all the way in the back, and a good topic to discuss. How many of you would say that non-formal learning had as much learning effect on you as schooling? Wow.
Impacted by
Okay. So do we need schools? Okay. So it seems to have an effect on us. So the discussion of connections between non-formal learning and schools is something that will be a panel and workshop led by Hannah. Our Hannah is somewhere also in the back. Hello, Hannah. And then for the third and maybe the most sensitive topic in a way, well, all of them are a little bit sensitive, is about socioeconomic background. So, let me see. How many of you are migrants if the definition of a migrant is living in a country you were not born in? Okay. Some of us. Okay. Me included, by the way. How many of you have attained a degree or education higher than your parents? Thank you very much. So, there is hope then that education provides some kind of forward mobility, and I want to leave you with that. And hope, the panel on socioeconomic inequalities will be moderated by me, and I'm looking forward to our discussions during the panels, during the workshops, during the coffee breaks and all the things. Use your opportunities, bridge with whoever you can, bond, but don't forget bonding. The biggest power we have is the power of relationships between humans. So let's continue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lana. As the chair of the SIRIUS Network, I'm really glad to welcome you in this broader discussion about inclusive education. And I wanted to put our conference in the context of the current European elections. So how many of you out here are eligible to vote in the European elections? Just raise your hand, you don't have to stand up, okay? How many of you have already voted in the European elections in the past, okay? How many of you, for you, will this be the first time that you're voting in the European elections? Yes. We are not normal. Many of us here are active citizens who are benefiting enormously from the opportunities that the European Union offers us to study, to learn, to teach, but we are also benefiting in order to grow the programs that we believe in. And many of us know how to use our civic and political rights, but there are millions of young people who have just come of age and who haven't gotten the citizenship education that they deserve. But there are just as many adults who have just become European Union citizens through naturalization, or who have moved abroad. We've never had as many Europeans living in another member state as we do today. And we have many second generation who might feel European but are not told that they are European. So it is our duty in the next 15 days to find a way to express why inclusive education matters in the European elections and why we are asking all of our friends to go out and vote. For me, inclusive education means that everyone should be able to use the opportunities of our education systems, of the European Union, and of our European citizenship. So the first thing we're going to be asking you to do in the breakout sessions is to write down, what does inclusive education mean for you? Why is it so important? Now, in motivating people and sharing that personal message is extremely important to explain why you're voting, this time why you're voting for inclusive education. But I wanted to put in a little bit of context the kinds of tools that you could be using over the next 15 days in order to spread this message. Now, why, as I would say from SIRIUS perspective, am I voting? Well, I'm voting because the European Union could do a lot more to help promote diversity and inclusion in our schools, also for migrant pupils. Looking at the EU's indicators on integration over the past decade, education results are actually going up for the second generation in terms of their basic skills and their attainment in the school system, but they still are disadvantaged compared to other pupils. And more broadly, thinking from inclusive education, we do have around 4 million people who benefit from Erasmus, but that's a very small percentage of students in the European Union. And we have youth unemployment in the European Union at around 14.5%, up to 30% in Greece, Italy, and Spain. So there's a lot more that the European Union can be doing. We, with SIRIUS, have been working with the European Parliament to try to particularly address the gaps for asylum-seeking children and refugee children. We published a report back to school with the European Parliament that used the data from the RefuEdu project and was written by Claudia Kohler on behalf of SIRIUS. And this current European Parliament has been really helpful to push for more inclusive education for migrant pupils. But this new European Parliament that we're facing might look very different. The traditional parties are receiving less and less support, and it might be that far-right parties end up being the third largest force in the European Union. And why is that? It's because people don't realize that in a low-turnout election, like the European elections, a few thousand votes can matter a lot. This is the current state of the forecast for the Croatian participation in the European elections. What you don't see there in the bottom is that last time turnout in the European elections in Croatia was 25%. So that means that the first party will beat the second party in the European elections by around 80,000 votes. But if you count non-voters are 2.8 million votes. The largest party in the European election are non-voters. So if you can actually reach out to those people and encourage them to participate, you will have a huge effect on the European elections. And the point is that many first-time voters, including young people, they don't have the information that we have. So I really recommend you go to This Time I'm Voting by the European Parliament. People don't know when the election is happening 15 days from now. They don't talk about it on social media with their friends and share their personal stories. And they don't know very basic things like how to vote. How do I do a proxy vote? How do I actually register to vote if I have to vote? These are basic things that we have to communicate. If you want to share information, the European Parliament has brought together great information, so you can see on every region of Europe what Europe does for me in my particular region. I learned so much about what Europe is doing for my area of Brussels to invest in, for example, preschool and non-formal education. But the European Parliament has also, on Europe Does for Me, provided a whole series of very simple Europe Does in the area of education. 23 panels that are very well detailed. So I really recommend, if you want to learn how you can communicate in the areas you're working on, that you go to this site and summarize it. And the European elections is politics, and which will be bringing us into our next panel. People don't know which parties actually represent their values. Other than the far-right parties that everyone talks about, they don't know what the party's positions are. So I really recommend you go to the European Youth Forum that has created a comparator tool with nearly all of the European political groups and has asked them what are their positions on social rights, on equal and open societies, on migration. And there you can see what those parties said are their priorities, for example, in the area of education. So you as educators, as teachers, as NGOs, can be sharing this information. It's nonpartisan information. But what really works for first-time voters are voter aid applications. Some of them might exist in your own countries. I'm going to show you 2 at the European level that are available in all European languages, like all of the previous information I shared with you. Your Vote Matters looks at how MEPs voted in the last parliament, and you can then vote yourself. So do you think that the EU needs a larger budget in the future? And only 72% of the current MEPs agreed with you here. Actually, of people who took the test, not many people think that the EU should have a larger budget. So you might think that, but maybe a lot of other citizens don't understand why the EU budget is helping to finance inclusive education. So if you go to Your Vote Matters and take the test, you get your match. It matches you to the politician in Europe that agrees with you the most, also in your country. And it matches you to particular political groups, so you can actually see who is running. There's a similar test called EU and I 2019.eu. And again, it shows you which individual parties you agree with, but it also shows me, I took the test, these are my results, that actually they're the best match for me as a party in Austria. Think of how useful this is for teaching people about European citizenship. So I really recommend that you orient people to these very fun tools that help them to realize why they should be voting. So in our multi-stakeholder panel that we're having now, we're going to be talking about what it really means to be doing inclusive education, but also what it means to be doing this in a political environment, particularly in today's Europe, where an inclusive, diverse, and mobile Europe is not a given for the future. So we're going to be asking our various panelists what they're trying to do through their work in institutions, as politicians, to try and fight for inclusive education. So maybe now we can welcome our panel to come on up and we'll briefly introduce them. Plan for this multi-level panel is to ask our speakers, we've already given them just 5 minutes, and that's all they're going to have, to talk about their vision of inclusive education and how concretely they're trying to work on this. Afterwards, Lana and I will ask some key questions, thinking about the 3 workshops that we're looking at on multilingualism, socioeconomic inclusion, and non-formal education, and then we'll take some questions from you in the audience. So, first I'd like to introduce Manos Antoninis, who is the director of the Global Education Monitoring Report of UNESCO. We have copies of that report out at the entrance. This report last year was really looking at the links between mobility and education. So what it means to be a student whose family is moving within your country, who's moving internationally, as economic migrants, as refugees, and what that means also for diversity in our education systems.
Then I would like to introduce Maria Golubova, Member of Parliament of Latvia, a new policymaker for us. We've known her for a long time as a researcher, also as an activist, and we'll hear from her this new role of policymaker.
Then we'll have Sobra Nourani, who is from the European Commission, where she is an education policy and system analyst for the Eurydice network, that most of you will know as a European network that is monitoring the education system and policies across the countries that participate in Erasmus+. Their latest Eurydice report on the education of migrant pupils is available online, and there's a great simple infographic also just outside.
And our last speaker at the panel will be Daniel Pop from Open Society Foundation, Senior Team Manager, an organization that has worked on inclusive education in our region, which is like the eastern part of EU and then all the way to Mongolia for over 20 years and have supported inclusive education in many different ways. So, thank you very much. Now you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Lana. Thank you very much, Tom, for the invitation. It's for me an unusual audience to be addressing, in the sense that our report, as one of global coverage, does try to bring the global dimensions of the different issues together. It's actually people from you that we draw all our evidence and then help spread it to the rest of the world. As Lana said, our last report focused on migration, and we use a lot of evidence from the SIRIUS network and the NEPC indicators that really helps our audiences around the world. And our next report on inclusion, which is due in a year from now, is actually looking forward to the collaboration with NEPC and the member institutions and think tanks of that group to help spread the concept of inclusive education much more broadly. Let me say a couple of words. The report exists since 2002, and it was established at a time when the international community needed an independent voice to help give a good picture of how the world was making progress towards the international education targets. Now, these targets at that time, around 2000, were essentially targets that were referring to the world's poorest countries. So between 2000 and 2015, the main education agenda was the Education for All agenda. It was a human rights-based agenda. It was very much focused on inclusion, but it had been formed from a very particular perspective, roughly speaking, determined by richer countries, saying what are the priorities for the world's richest governments, how to direct their aid programs to the poorest countries and achieve essentially universal primary completion and gender parity in education. But in 2015, the world got together, or in the run-up to 2015, got together and came up with a new development agenda that has some very important features. First of all, it united this strand that was focusing on poverty reduction with a strand that for many years was focusing on environmental sustainability. So since 2015, we have a universal development agenda, which is called the Sustainable Development Goals. 17 goals, of which one is on education, and it has the word inclusive, the inclusiveness in its target, because it calls on countries to ensure equitable, inclusive education of equality for all, including lifelong learning opportunities. And our report, this time, since 2015, although it started as a project based, hosted and published by UNESCO, is now commissioned by the world governments to monitor progress towards this agenda until 2030. And we have an international advisory board that advises on the topics, and that's how we came up with the topics of migration and inclusion. But what has changed, as you understand from this way that the strategy, the goals were formulated, is that this agenda is now universal. It's a universal agenda, which means that the lessons have to be drawn for all countries. The common lines, the common issue, the common things, there are no poor and rich countries in that respect, but a common thread that we need to draw between these issues. So when it comes to inclusion, and I will stop here, is that our key effort is to highlight precisely the concern that Lana was mentioning earlier, that even though in a group like ours, we very much understand what inclusive education means, around the world there is still a problem in understanding that inclusive education really is for all. It's not about taking groups individually and designing programs for each one separately, but in conceiving inclusive education as a foundation for our cultures, for our societies, and for our education systems.
Thank you very much, Manos. Thank you so much. So, thank you, Manos, again. Maria, we give the floor now to you.
Is this working?
Yes.
Yes. So, well, first of all, let me say how very honored I am to be back at the NEPC event. You know, I used to be part of the family for a long time, and coming back in a new capacity is really great and also a little bit scary. When I thought, what shall I say in this panel? You know, I think for a change, I'll say something from my new perspective as a member of parliament, trying to work on inclusive education issues from that perspective. And one thing which for me was the first culture shock, moving from the NGO and researcher and consultant perspective to member of parliament perspective, is that this is much less about data, this is much less about evidence, and this is much less about, you know, activism and stakeholder interest in issues. This is much more about institutional kind of interest. And institutional interest, of course, carries with it a certain element of institutional selfishness. Because when you have actors on whom the existence or non-existence of inclusive education in our schools depends, you have municipalities, you have ministries, you have agencies, you have teachers, you have various organizations that are responsible for budgetary issues, for projects, for funding, for supporting or not supporting some policy change. You very often hear arguments that are based not so much on stakeholder needs or on data, but you hear very strong arguments, very, how shall I say, very determined arguments on behalf of institutions that are working for self-preservation. So it's very difficult to overcome that first barrier to even start the real discussion about inclusive education per se. So that's one reality one has to deal with. The second level of culture shock, if you wish, comes with the realization that while always in my life here within Network of Education Policy Centers and as education policy consultant later on, I used to think that education is mostly about what education systems do and about what schools do. Whereas very often when it comes to inclusive education, it's also about what others do. It's about what are the social support functions in the community and in the country that would basically allow schools to do their job. That would allow, for example, a child with special needs to get to school, would allow the parents to have time to work and not just look after the child, would allow the actual process of teaching and learning to take place meaningfully because other issues would be taken care of, because very often they're not taken care of. Very often when there is a social policy to support a certain target group, it doesn't necessarily mean that if it exists on paper, it really works and functions well in reality. So very often we do not see the children that are most in need of inclusive education. Actually, very often we don't see them in schools, even in developed countries. And, well, I consider my country a developed country. So there is a point at which we just need to look outside the school and outside the education systems and see what can be done to improve the social support. Point three, another level of realization of how things are different from this perspective as compared to the researcher and NGO perspective. There is a certain element of gravitation towards the so-called hard policy issues. It's always easier to get a dialogue starting about making a new institution or allocating some budget funding. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's very difficult to get actual budget funding allocated, and it's not likely to happen quickly in most cases. But at least that kind of dialogue, people understand, and institutions understand, and you can start to build some coalitions around it. Whereas when it comes to a more theory-based or data-based approach to let's change the paradigm or let's change the conceptual approach to how we do things, that's where the real difficulties start, because that's what people do not want to buy. And there we come inevitably to one observation I have regarding what it might take to actually get those conceptual shifts that we need, because very often when we look at how education happens in our schools, we do not really have the right approaches to a person's right to get quality education, not just society's need that this person is somehow educated and can do some kind of a job. To have this kind of conceptual shift, we actually need to have allies, and sometimes we find allies in unexpected places. When I was trying to make an event about inclusive education in the parliament, at first it didn't go so well with some of the people responsible, and the only way I could actually get really good support for this event to happen and for all the stakeholders to come together and to hear the voices of parents and organizations representing, for example, children with autism and cognitive development issues, was through the support of a right-wing politician who used to be very hardline on all issues to do with bad behavior and stuff like that, but who has a child with special education needs. I mean, there is this element of, as Lana said, relationships or human touch to those stories, where you need to actually look at how people who do not necessarily align with your ideology can help you towards the goal you want to achieve, such as having quality education for all, independently of their social background, ethnic background, special needs, etc. You sometimes find those allies in unexpected places.
Maria? I'm sorry, something went wrong there. Thank you, Maria. And we move now to Mr. Rami from the European Commission.
Yes, good morning. I would like to start maybe by just briefly saying a little bit about Eurydice, what it is that we do and who we are. So Eurydice, as Thomas said, is a unit located in the European Commission's Executive Agency for Education, and it's also a network of 42 representatives of ministries of education that cooperate together to gather information and provide comparative analysis and a comparative view on various issues related to education in Europe. And so in January this year, we published a comparative report on integrating students from migrant backgrounds into schools in Europe. And we did this as a response to a need for evidence. At least there was a very strong need for evidence 2 years ago, following the refugee and migrant waves that were happening in Europe, for evidence of what is happening at a policy level to promote this issue. And I think so one of these challenges, apart from the ongoing efforts that need to be invested in promoting inclusive education as such, is to also keep on maybe the emphasis and the momentum and keeping this and the challenges of specific groups such as migrant students keeping it very policy relevant. So what we did is to gather information through our network and to produce this report where we look at various key policies promoted by top-level education authorities in the areas of access to education, the kind of language support, learning support, also psychosocial support that should be provided to students from a migrant background, the kind of support that should also be given to teachers, school heads, the involvement of parents, and also the wider local community and professionals, as well as some governance mechanisms, such as the monitoring of policies, the funding, also the assessment of their impact and so on. So we present in this report that you have the flyer at the table and a link to the full report there. A very comprehensive mapping of these policies, but we also try to shed some light or put some emphasis on two specific dimensions that we identified based on the available academic research literature, and which seem to be very much at the heart of when it comes to promoting migrant student integration. And one is what we called making room for diversity in schools, and at the heart of this dimension obviously is the issue of languages and promoting adequate language provision and support to migrant students. So just to give maybe some examples, we looked across Europe to see what are the policies and measures in place, and when it comes to additional classes in the language of instruction, the majority of European countries promote this issue of course, in schools, although there are differences, so not all countries have developed, for example, a curriculum that is specifically dedicated to teaching the language of instruction to students who speak this language as a second language, which obviously makes a difference. And but when we compare this then to home language teaching, for example, there are only 13 education systems out of 42 across Europe that have policies in place promoting actually the mother tongue teaching of students in school. And this is quite surprising given that through the academic research literature we can see that mother tongue teaching is instrumental in not only promoting students bilingualism or multilingualism, it is also conducive to actually helpful for learning the language of instruction, and also it promotes, it supports students' development of their identity, and not only the language of instruction, but also their own language and culture are valued within the school context, of course. And the second dimension that we highlight in our report is what we call taking a whole child approach to learning and in schools, which means basically not only taking into account students' academic development, knowledge and skills, but also their social and emotional competences and development, which is really the foundation based on which learning can actually occur. And so once again, we analyzed a large number of policies from this angle, basically. And overall, we can see that apart from a minority of countries, some Southern European countries, some Scandinavian countries, which really explicitly put a focus on this issue, the focus mainly everywhere is on what students know and should be able to do, and less on how they feel and whether they are in a state in which learning and their development can really flourish. So this is basically maybe a little overview of this report, and obviously we carry out these activities within the context of the Commission's and GGEF's wider initiatives in the area of promoting the education of vulnerable groups and promoting also language awareness, multilingualism through the sharing of good practices, peer learning, and also financial instruments such as
We go to our last panelist, Daniel.
Hi. I'm coming from the Open Society Foundation, which is known in the region for many things, and others seem to know better what we do than us ourselves these days, which is great. We achieved one objective, being known. But what is important when it comes to inclusive education, the work that non-state actors like us is promoting and doing, is that change is happening, and there's a lot of things that have changed in the last 30 years in this region, quite extensive. But one thing stayed constant, and that is not a positive, unfortunately. It has to do with we are still trying to fix education. This fixing mode, that there's something wrong in education that needs to be fixed, is what is underscoring most of the discussions and most of the issues when it comes to education policy, education action. Where we stand in this discussion, it's really not the debate whether education needs or needs not fixing. It's really who should be doing the whatever is being done. And this is where the role of non-state actors in our vision is very important, in the sense that this values the ideas of inclusion, the ideas of catering for needs and services of diverse communities, when it comes to learning and nurturing next generations of citizens and people in the countries, need to be something that is owned by the communities and owned by the people in their respective societies. And it's not something that is done by a government necessarily, it's not done by someone else, but it is owned by the populace in those specific countries. And that in itself, it's fundamental and very important for us. And when we look in specific policies, even in the global perspective, but in Europe, the objectives, and Thomas was right about the elections, we're also having a new programming period. In the last one, the objective, one of the key objectives in education of the European Commission was to achieve a 90% graduation rate in compulsory level education, which meant leaving 10% behind POK by the end of 2020. Which when you look at Europe, how many children that means, it's a lot. And you know it's not a random selection, it's very specific biases who those children are. And maybe the last point before Thomas shows me the 1 minute thing is how do we make sure that people understand that education is a public societal good beyond the individual objective of catering for their own children. And there is a humongous tension in that space that parents see their scope and mission is to care for their own children first, and maybe second for broader societal objectives. But when it comes to abstract ideas, as Thomas says, 25% show up, for instance, in elections. And we see them in school as well. When we have the discussion about general service provision, it's a lot of agency of parents. But when it comes to the needs and the specific objectives related to, for instance, education inclusion, the room tends to be empty. And that's a big challenge and it's a big problem. We somehow didn't get to the point where collective objectives are embraced by individuals in that space when it comes to education stakeholders. It is very much a reflection of society in which you have to be successful, and that's your objective as an individual or as a family. But when it comes to community and community actions, especially the refugee crisis, which is actually not, the crisis wasn't crazy either. The refugee arrivals in Europe actually were perceived as being a crisis because of not action, not because of inability or not because of lack of capacity, but because of inaction. And I think that is, if you look in the next 3 years, as Magnus does, 20 years, it's really how do we get to that space, right? Where the old values of just looking beyond the community become very fundamental, and we go back to talking about the big issues of society, and maybe improving on that 10% leaving behind it's okay as a policy objective, right? That's it.
Thank you very much, Manuel. I just want to ask the audience now to start preparing your questions. You have you have a little blocks of paper in your bags, and those who didn't get, I hope you can get some paper. And if you have a question, please write it down. Try to write it as clearly as you can. And people will come to the end of your rows and collect questions. Meanwhile, Thomas and me, I think, have a few questions. Thomas, do you want to start us off?
So my question was for Manos because, if any of you have read the report, it's very clever by arguing that migration and education, this is not an issue that's just for a specific set of peoples, right? Because around the world, countries' education systems are confronted by different ways that migration creates needs and opportunities. So you looked at what it's like when children are moving within a country, what it's like when they're moving abroad for different reasons, also then when we have more diversity in schools, how the schools address it. So you took this broad issue, and in each chapter you really looked at the specific needs. How do you sum all of that up, right? Because in some way the risk is that still people say, well, we don't have that group and that group and that group, and we're doing fine. How do you argue that migration diversity is making school systems more diverse, and so in general, here are the kinds of needs that we see for all of these types of groups? How do you sum that up?
As I mentioned earlier, the report always faces the challenge of having to address a global audience, and inevitably, an issue may be relevant in one country but not in another. The one report before was on accountability in education, maybe the thing that addresses all of us. But we have to address countries that have no accountability and countries that have too much accountability. The same thing happened with migration. As you say, in addition to having to make it relevant for all countries in the world, which it is relevant for all countries in the world if you consider that mobility exists in every country. Another criticism that we really wanted to avoid was that we were going to be a migration report, not an education report, and therefore we had to classify very carefully each category and what specific needs have to be addressed for an asylum seeker or an internal migrant with a permit or without a permit, and legal or illegal, voluntary or not. that was a criticism that we wanted to avoid, because we wanted to look at the issue not from the perspective of an immigration official, but from the perspective of an education planner or a teacher who's confronted in a classroom with a very diverse set of pupils. As with inclusive education, everybody's diverse. That's the only thing that keeps us common and similar. And therefore, that's why we look at the perspective of the effect of population movements on education systems, which sometimes can be severe, but also what education can do to change our ability to manage all these migration movements, which is the opposite diversion. And indeed, we saw as a common thread this need for teachers to be able to address the needs. Inclusion of migrants and refugees in education systems is the key recommendation, but even if you take that as a starting point and as a principle, you still need to respond to the needs. And that applies to whether you are a Chinese rural migrant and the teacher discriminates against you because you speak a slightly different dialect, to whether you are a migrant in a European country, or whether you are a refugee in some remote part of Africa, where you still need to address very similar issues of language, very similar issues of poverty and exclusion, and very real issues that we're going to discuss later, formal versus non-formal education opportunities that need to be flexible to adjust to your needs.
Can I actually ask Sogol, because it's a related question. I mean, when we were liaising with UNESCO, you let us know, well, you guys actually in Europe have so much data and so many comparisons that's quite useful for our global work. So that's, I guess, assuming that we in Europe have actually addressed these types of needs, or we have these kind of tools. I mean, what did you see in Eurydice when you looked at, I mean, on language, because you mentioned that as a particular issue, but more broadly on the whole of child approach? I mean, can you give us an idea of where you see this kind of adaptation? Is it common across Europe? Is it only in certain types of education systems?
I'm not sure what you mean by adaptation. I think what I tried to say initially is that we saw a very strong policy interest around this specific topic in 2016 when there was a sort of crisis, and when there was a moment where there was a lot of attention devoted to this topic. And basically, once the report was finished, this sort of like strong interest was not there anymore, or not as much. And I think probably the challenges they are still the same now as 2 years ago. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement when it comes to these specific areas that I've been mentioning. And we only obviously focus in our work on what policymakers, what top-level regulations and recommendations exist out there. But definitely, especially maybe also in areas that I just mentioned, like home language teaching, or areas that move away a bit from the academic realm and go into the social emotional, I think probably there is a large potential for better collaboration with civil society and migrant communities who I'm also talking about parents. There's always an effort to involve parents in school level work, but maybe actually they could have a much stronger role when it comes to supporting children within their language or social emotionally. Maybe that's where they have much more that they can actually contribute. So in terms of policies, we see that there's a lot of room for more support, more commitment, especially when it comes to catering really to the diverse needs of students. And migrant students, I mean, there might be some very specific language-related needs, but apart from that, we're really talking about a very diverse student population in schools in Europe who have very diverse needs. So it's really about, taking a very student-centered approach and trying to address all these diverse needs to support students.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry the part died again on me. Can I just remind everybody that if you do have questions, please do write them down. Soon we will go to your questions. I have a question for Maria. Manos was talking about sustainable development goals. What I found that in our part of Europe, they're very invisible. There seems to be no recognition of what our governments made a promise on in the sustainable development goals. I'm wondering, from your point of view as a policymaker, what can we do to make this a little bit more visible and to start really seeing goals which are not only EU goals, but let's say global goals as part of the mission of the policy in that?
Well, if you want to be realistic, I would say that without major support from the EU, we're not likely to get a monitoring mechanism that would be really binding for countries and would really, at least within the EU, and would really make them pay more attention to reporting on their progress towards those goals. Because, I mean, at least from my experience, not just in Latvia, EU countries take it much more seriously when it's, for example, the European semester and the reporting you have to do within that framework, and they monitor much more specifically what is happening there. But when it comes to SDGs, there just isn't as strong a monitoring mechanism that would allow that, or would, well, not allow, we are allowed to do it now, but we're not doing it, but would sort of induce this to happen. And sometimes you need inducing, not just allowing. But I think that there are groups within at least all countries I know in Europe and its near neighborhood that are interested, I mean civil society organizations that are interested in monitoring and in following up of the country's commitments on SDGs. It's just that in order for the government to take it more seriously, we need stronger mechanisms.
Okay. For Daniel, question. One of, I guess, things that you have been working on a lot is this idea of, are we really funding through EU projects those who really need to be funded? So who are the most vulnerable, or are we funding these groups of, or who are we funding the top of the vulnerable group and not forgetting kind of the bottom of the vulnerable group? Would you like to comment on that a little bit? I know it's not a simple question, but
no, I mean,
and how can we mitigate maybe?
It has to do with expectations and needs. I mean, there is a big discussion about what are those expectations and needs that are fair and can be met by social interventions. And one of the big areas of work of OSF has been, for instance, Roma rights, Roma education rights, Roma citizen rights, which has been one of the most systematic forms of discriminations against citizens in the whole of the region and whole of Europe in general. And that is has been such a structured way of discriminating against a group without any obvious reason that I don't think has got there. So we had the Roma decade as a big process. It's hard to say that we are there, right? I mean, in a sense that something has happened. And the shifts today, and this is why I said it's 30 years, that not much has changed. I mean, 3 years the big discussion was freedom. Now people seem to be less excited about their freedoms, right? Like freedom of voting and freedom of expressing themselves, which is a huge challenge in a way. And this is where their policy gets into very diverse, of creating those common spaces of understanding of common purpose and common objective. It's becoming increasingly a challenge. And in that space, usually, well, people tend to turn selfish. I mean, you are on your own in dealing with your problems. And this is what happened in Lana's specific questions about EU funding. Is EU funding the solution, right? I mean, can you fund social action as a public agent through a market mechanism? And most of you come from civil society organizations, and usually what happens where we work, people spend most of their time servicing the writing and the reporting of projects rather than doing the work they meant to do, right? Which might be part of the system, is not necessarily bad, but instead of doing the work that we sort of wanted to do, we ended up doing something else. And is that a good thing? That has been one of the discussions out there. And it's not just here, it's university research frameworks and all these market mechanisms that sometimes keeps people very, very busy doing many, many things, but maybe just in other things that are more urgent or more useful. So that's, I don't know if that's an answer.
Thank you, Daniel. Thomas, do we have more questions, or should we open to the...
Let's see if we have.
Okay. It seems we have only a few questions, and soon they will come to us. So start. Okay. Stephen Brady.
In the meantime, I had a question then following up, either for Soro or for Manos about again about the SDGs, because you know, from our work on migrant and refugee education and integration, we see that there is a potential with the global compacts on migration and refugees to actually argue that the way to make sure that you're delivering on these commitments for more safe and orderly migration and protection is by making sure that you're including migrants in all of your SDG goals. There's a lot of research in how we can make sure that we're monitoring those groups, and I think in the European space, a lot of things to the EU, we have a lot of this type of data. Do you see a lot of potential here to use the SDGs to draw attention to all of these different types of groups and show them as part of an overall need? How do you see that moving forward from your different institutions?
Let me take that question first. The Global Compact for Migration and the Global Compact for Refugees are, like the Sustainable Development Goals, non-legally binding. So it is the collective desire of countries to try and find a solution, but stop short of committing themselves too much. It is a very interesting perspective that the SDGs, the so-called Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, has a very elaborate mechanism that is called the follow-up and review mechanism. But the word accountability is absent. It's not really absent from it. Why? Because for the first time, that was a positive thing. It was not an agenda determined by some countries for some others. It was a joint agreement, which was a positive step. But then countries and member states, as organizations, have very little desire to be held to account. Because who is going to hold them to account? So the word very much disappeared. By contrast, when it comes to the individual agendas for every sector, for every goal, there where international organizations have a stronger say, sometimes, like in education, the word accountability props up very, very, very strongly. And that's how reports like ours exist. Because somehow it's a different dialogue, and the idea of proper monitoring does get tolerated. However, let's not underestimate what countries have committed to do, because there is a mechanism currently which is the high-level political forum, which is the apex institution, a meeting of the heads of states every July in New York, which receives input from countries, first of all. Countries voluntarily submit their national reviews on progress towards the SDGs. It has weaknesses, but it is one opportunity. Other organizations, intergovernmental or civil society, the so-called major groups, education has one, also have the opportunity to contribute. And all goals are not reviewed every year. So this year is a goal for education. And we are publishing a special publication for the high-level political forum on the occasion of the review of SDG 4 for the first time in 4 years. And what we've done is we followed a slightly different one, because approach. Our report is very critical. Sometimes it says things about countries. In the Netherlands, for example, our report was discussed a lot, because drawing also on work that Tom Steve has done in the past, we're saying that the Netherlands is going backwards in terms of following a model of education towards migrants. It's more assimilationist than it used to be in the past. So the report can be quite critical. But sometimes it doesn't always work. Sometimes what you need to do is to document good and positive examples. So what we're trying to do this year with this report, and with actually inputs from countries, is to draw attention for the world at important aspects of policy where there needs to be progress. And this idea of inclusion and equity is new. If you look at the world as a whole, on the planet, maybe not in Europe, actually we're very far behind. And the European example, which we may be criticizing, actually does serve as a very positive example, not only in terms of examples like Ireland or Portugal that are really considered very, very advanced in their approach towards inclusion, but also in the way the European Union creates the conditions, sometimes market-based, but sometimes also with respect to member states' willingness to engage on a dialogue on education around the same table, which is not happening in other parts of the world with the same degree of seriousness and concern. So that's an example that through the global mechanism we can export to the rest of the world, because it does offer the promise through policy dialogue to make progress on an issue like inclusion, which otherwise can be very easily neglected.
Okay, thank you. So some questions from the audience, perhaps? Okay. I will try to sum them up because they're all very long. So one about how do we sell the idea of inclusive education to different groups? One is about exhausted teachers in schools with lack of resources and competences. And the other one to local education authorities who see inclusion or may see inclusion as a left-wing socialist maneuver rather than something for everybody. I'll read one more question and then maybe the panelists can choose which one they want to answer. The other one is about how do we make space for addressing diversity in the classroom and implementing inclusive education in systems which have very strict curriculums and are actually only interested in training for the test or preparing students for tests. So, any volunteers?
Well, I can take the teachers and municipalities.
Yes, please.
Yes, I mean, being there, seen that. The difficulty with convincing, overstressed and overworked teachers that they will also take on extra tasks in order to include a child or two or three who need more effort from the teachers to include them is a dramatic issue, because many of our education systems are underfinanced and or badly organized. And the issue of low salaries, big workload are real issues. I think the first step towards selling our agenda of inclusive education to teachers and municipalities, however sad this might be, is go back and try to reform our education systems to actually reduce the workload of those teachers who are overworked, or make sure that the workload consists of something meaningful. Very often they're overworked because part of their workload is not something they themselves see as meaningful work, but has to do with reporting, or has to do with doing things their school wants them to do, or their municipality wants them to do. And second thing is, yes, sometimes we have to be unpopular, because the issue with low teacher salaries very often is linked, at least in my part of the world, with the issue of too many teachers. Because very often the populations have gone down, and we are reluctant as politicians to say we should cut the number of schools, we should cut the number of teachers. However, if we do that and go through all the unpopular steps, we will actually be able to fund the teachers who work in schools at a much better level and be able to motivate them to work much more meaningfully, if you see what I mean. So one thing is, yes, go through all the reform stuff of the education system, which is horribly difficult. And as to municipalities and the ideological argument that this is left-wing stuff, the inclusive education thing, and that is indeed an argument one hears in places, or one also hears the argument that it's a matter of fashion. So for example, having an individual plan for a student with special education need is a matter of fashion. I think we have to just make sure that our legislation and our regulations actually do make it clear that no, this is not a matter of ideology or fashion, this is a matter of basic requirement. You need to have an individual plan for a student who needs more attention from the teachers, and very often we have many of those students. And for that we need to work together with all stakeholders and convince those who don't think it's important that we need to pass this legislation. Without that, we cannot get to it.
I think marketing is a good idea. I have to say one of the most striking examples, I'm probably traveling too much, I'm flying, I'm spending time in airport, but there's this advertisement of one very large bank that says the one thing that makes us all different, or the same, is that they were all different. And it uses very, very nice visuals with birds or with all sorts of creatures that look very different, and yet they belong to the same species, let's say. And such approach actually isn't really needed for inclusive education. We can, and it's true even for the education community. There is a very popular graph which tries to distinguish between integration, inclusion, parallel systems, exclusion. We do need these visuals. It's not often immediately obvious, even to people in education, let alone the people we need to influence in parliament, what these terms mean and what positive effects they have. So I would not underestimate. As to whether it is, and as you say, in many countries, reforms toward inclusive education are being perceived as reforms to remove resources from education. Again, that's another problem that we need to confront. As to whether inclusive education reforms are socialist reforms, I'm surprised to hear that. The very purpose we're trying to discuss with NEPC, the European Agency on Inclusive Education and Special Needs, the prospect of regional reports, building on the global reports on inclusive education, specifically for the former transition countries, exactly because the very concept of inclusive education is warped in many of these countries. In fact, it was quite the opposite, and I think you know probably much better than me about what I'm talking about. So it's actually an interesting question that has come up. It's probably, maybe in Western Europe, maybe that would be perceived like this, but in Eastern Europe it should be completely the opposite. Teaching to the test is of course a very important constraint towards inclusive education. In the report we are, actually I was thinking about that earlier when you were asking us questions, and we had to classify ourselves whether we belonged to a group or not. That's a very sensitive question for so many issues. And of course the state can choose ways to classify. There are official survey forms, questionnaires, where there are categories where you need to list yourself. And there's also the self-selection, whether you volunteer to belong to a group. And in many countries, that's not a very easy issue. So that's one aspect of inclusive education that we cannot underestimate. It's very complex, and it's one that we will be addressing. But then there's also the practical issue of tests and how incentives are stacked up against inclusive education when schools need to appear to be doing better, and therefore choose to exclude. Maybe not so much in Europe, but let's say in the United States as a major issue, but it's coming into Europe increasingly. It's a threat. It's an issue we covered in the accountability report. So yeah, all these issues need to be answered.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of more questions. I will just look and see if the other two panelists can, a lot of them are, of course, big questions. So what should be the appropriate strategies to move from appreciation of child's needs to children's rights? That's one. And the other one is about Roma and the fact that, Roma Europeans are one of the ancient experiences of diversity in Europe, and yet we still haven't achieved their full integration or full social cohesion, and that only OSF is working on these programs, somebody claims, while there is not enough research and discussion about these families and students in many European countries.
Maybe just on the issue of rights, we try to, obviously, as a starting point, look at whether students with migrant background have the same rights and obligations when it comes to schools as their native peers. And obviously, that's a very, very basic and very critical issue. And it's surprising to see that even though a majority of European countries gives migrant students the same rights and obligations to attend school, there are a number of countries where migrant students, especially those with an asylum seeker status or undocumented migrants, they may have the same rights to education but not the same obligations, so they do not have to attend school. And then there are also a number of countries where these students, once again, asylum seekers, mainly undocumented migrants, they do not even have the same right to education. So they do have the right to attend separate education but not mainstream education. And so obviously this puts them at a in a very difficult position, leading to further delays that they may have already experienced. And the situation is even more difficult for students above compulsory school age. So for those who arrive in a new country, and again, with asylum seeker status especially, they do not have the same rights to compensatory education to basically obtain their basic qualification in around 13 European countries. And even in countries where this right exists, we didn't go further in this direction, but it is not entirely clear what kind of education opportunities exist for students who are above a certain age and do not have the same qualifications, and also certain specific, for example, language-related needs. So this is definitely a concerning area that should be further.
If you take learning as the bottom line, that learning is good, and it's at an individual development level and a societal level, it's really why we don't have same opportunities of learning for everyone. What are the barriers, specific personal characteristics create in terms of accessing same levels and same qualities of learning opportunities out there? And this is really becomes quickly a very sensitive discussion, because we start to see that it has to do with gender, has to do with race, has to do with language, has to do with constructs in society. And those constructs in society come from somewhere and maintained by some specific understandings. And one of the big efforts that we as a foundation have tried to always make that these values are not foreign values. These are not values that come from somewhere to these specific societies, but they have been. Senses of fairness and senses of justice have been part of every single society, and none of the societies achieved their own sense of fairness. And if learning is such a common sense, is asking the very difficult questions in as far as Tajik villages, when you have children with learning needs, but because of perception, why they have those special needs has to do with some sort of behavior of their parents as form of godly punishment, then you have a societal context and you have to problematize the question. And I think, and this is where I like this Marxism thing, because the latest I read it was we're actually sexo-Marxists, and if you promote human rights, right, in a sense, it becomes one of those topics in which human rights frameworks start to be an ideological agenda against something that is more humane and more something, I don't understand what that is. And this is where the big refugee arrival wave has showed us how unprepared we are as Europe. We were indulging ourselves in the understanding we dealt with problems of diversity through legislations, through regulatory framework, through budgeting for education, and a shrinking school population, oversized teacher body and schooling infrastructure. So what do you need more as a perfect ground for dealing with the provocation? Having everything on the table, and yet we just couldn't articulate the response. And it's not just response at the individual level, it's response at the political level, and starting to build fences in societies that were cutting wire 30 years down. So how come that is the end of these 30 years? I mean, I'm talking specifically Hungary, right? They just, and how do you get in that mood and what is happening? But that's where I think a lot of work is done, and I don't subscribe to the idea of PR and promoting, because this is something else. This is not selling something to someone, right? This is something people have, and people need to understand when they think that their children have the right to quality and free education, others might have the same right as well, or the legal claim for such a right. And I think this is where the discussion needs to be reframed a bit. That is where I'm coming from.
Thank you very much, Daniel. We are just in time to finish on time, so thank you very much to the panel. And I will give the floor now back to Aldo, so we can move away from the desk. Thank you again, Aldo.